All right, welcome back to Tragedy and Hope Live. We're on chapter 20 now. Tragedy and Hope, the Future in Perspective. The unfolding of time, the United States and the middle class crisis, European ambiguities, and the conclusion. All right, starting on page 1199. In an age of change and competing doubts, there is one thing of which we can be certain. The world is changing and will continue to change, but there is no consensus on the direction of such change. Human beings are basically conservative in the sense that they expect and wish to continue to jog along in the same old patterns. Accordingly, they tend to regard most changes as regrettable, although one might get the impression in a bustling and dynamic place like the United States that men preferred change to stability. It is perfectly true that Americans now have change built into the patterns of their lives, so that savings and investment and, in general, the flows of claims on wealth, what most of us call money, now go in directions that make constant change almost inevitable. Summer has hardly arrived before summer dresses have been sold out. Autumn clothing is beginning to arrive on the dealers' racks, and extensive plans are already in process to make next summer's clothing, which goes on sale in the southern resorts in winter, quite different. This year's cars are not yet available for sale when the manufacturers are planning changed versions for next year's models, and urban commercial buildings are still new when plans for remodeling or even total replacement are already stirring in someone's mind. In such an age, the sensible man can only reconcile himself to the fact change is inevitable, but few men, average or exceptional, feel any competency in deciding the direction that change will take. Forecasting can be attempted only by extrapolating recent changes into the future, but this is a risky business since there is never any certainty that present directions will be maintained. In attempting this risky procedure, we shall continue to divide society into 6 aspects, falling into 3 major areas of the patterns of power, reward, and outlooks. The area of power is largely, but not exclusively, concerned with military or political arrangements. The area of rewards is similarly concerned with economic and social arrangements, and the area of outlooks is concerned with patterns that might be termed religious and intellectual. Naturally, all these are different and even drastically different from one society to another, and even to a lesser extent between countries and areas within countries. For the sake of simplicity, we shall be concerned in this chapter with these patterns in Europe and the United States, although, as usual, we shall not hesitate to make comparisons with other cultures, especially with the Soviet Union. The unfolding of time. The political conditions of the latter half of the 20th century will continue to be dominated by the weapons situation, for while politics consist of much more than weapons, the nature, organization, and control of weapons is the most significant of the numerous factors that determine what happens in political life. Surely weapons will continue to be expensive and complex. This means that they will increasingly be the tools of professionalized, if not mercenary, forces. All of past history shows that the shift from a mass army of citizen soldiers to a smaller army of professional fighters leads, in the long run, to a decline of democracy. When weapons are cheap and easy to obtain and to use, almost any man may obtain them, and the organized structure of the society, such as the state, can obtain no better weapons than the ordinary, industrious private citizen. This very rare historical condition existed about 1880, but is now only a dim memory since the weapons obtainable by the state today are far beyond the pocketbook, understanding, or competence of the ordinary citizen. When weapons are of the amateur type of 1880, as they were in Greece in the 5th century BC, they are widely possessed by citizens, power is similarly dispersed, and no minority can compel the majority to yield to its will. With such an amateur weapons system, if other conditions are not totally unfavorable, we are likely to find majority rule and a relatively democratic political system. But, on the contrary, when a period can be dominated by complex and expensive weapons that only a few persons can afford to possess or can learn to use, we have a situation where the minority who control such specialist weapons can dominate the majority who lack them. In such a society, sooner or later, an authoritarian political system that reflects the inequality in control of weapons will be established. At the present time, there seems to be little reason to doubt that the specialist weapons of today will continue to dominate the military picture into the foreseeable future. If so, there is little reason to doubt that the authoritarian rather than democratic political regimes will dominate the world into the same foreseeable future. To be sure, traditions and other factors may keep democratic systems, or at least democratic forms, in many areas, such as the United States or England. To us, brought up as we were on a democratic ideology, this may seem very tragic, but a number of perhaps redeeming features in this situation may well be considered. For one, our society, Western civilization, is almost 1,500 years old and was democratic in political action for less than 200 of these years, or even half of that in strict truth. A period that is not democratic in its political structure is not necessarily bad and may well be one in which people can live a rich and full social or intellectual life whose value may be even more significant than a democratic political or military structure. Of equal significance is the fact that a period with a professionalized army may well be, as it was in the 18th century, a period of limited warfare seeking limited political aims, if for no other reason than that professionalized forces are less willing to kill and be killed for remote and total objectives. The amateur weapons of the late 19th century made possible the mass citizen armies that fought the American Civil War and both of this century's world wars. Such mass armies could not be offered financial rewards for risking their lives, but they could be offered idealistic, extreme, and total goals that would inspire them to a willingness to die and to kill, ending slavery, making a world safe for democracy, ending tyranny, spreading or at least saving the American way of life, offered such goals. But they led to a total warfare seeking total victory and unconditional surrender. As a result, each combatant country came to feel that its way of life, or at least its regime, was at stake in the conflict and could hardly be expected to survive defeat. Thus, they felt compulsion to fight yet more tenaciously. The result was ruthless wars of extermination such as World War II. With the continued professionalization of the armed forces caused by the increasing complexity of weapons, we may look forward with some assurance to less and less demand for total wars using total weapons of mass destruction to achieve unconditional surrender and unlimited goals. The rather naive American idea that war aims involve the destruction of the enemy's regime and the imposition on the defeated people of a democratic system with a prosperous economy, such as they have never previously known, will undoubtedly be replaced by the idea that the enemy regime must be maintained, perhaps in a modified form, so that we have some government with whom we can negotiate in order to obtain our more limited aims, which cause the conflict, and thus to lower the level of conflict as rapidly as possible, consistent with the achievement of our aims. The nature of such controlled conflict will be described in a moment. The movement towards professionalization of the armed forces and the resulting lowering of the intensity of conflict is part of a much larger process deriving from the nuclear and superpower stalemate between the Soviet Union and the United States. The danger of nuclear destruction will continue and become, if anything, more horrifying, but will, for this very reason, become more remote and less likely probability. In the late 1960s, the United States will have about 1,700 vehicles, missiles, and SAC planes targeted on the Soviet bloc. By 1970s, this will rise to about 2,400. Moreover, by 1970, 650 of these will be Polaris missiles on our 41 nuclear submarines, which cannot be found and eliminated by any Soviet missile counterstrike once they are submerged at sea. The great value of the Polaris over its land-based rivals, such as Minutemen, is that the Soviet Union knows where the latter are and can counter-target on them. This means that the MMs must be fired out of their silos before the Soviet warheads seeking them out to destroy them can arrive 15 minutes after takeoff. Such a precarious position encourages nervous anticipation and possibility of precipitate action, capable of beginning a war no one really wants. Thus, on an enormously greater scale, we have something like the von Schiffen plan that made it necessary for Germany to attack France in 1914 when there was no real issue justifying resort to war between them. The Polaris missiles at sea, since they cannot be found and counter-forced, can be delayed without need to strike first or even to strike second in immediate retaliation, but can be held off for hours, days, and weeks, compelling the Soviet to negotiate even after the original Soviet strike has devastated America's cities. Thus, the Soviet Union cannot win in a nuclear exchange, even if they make the first strike. The reverse is also true. In the mid-1960s, the Soviet Union has vehicles able to deliver up to 600 or 700 nuclear warheads on the United States and perhaps 700 or 800 on our European allies. Their warheads are larger than ours, with up to 100 megaton ICBMs, while our largest are 9 megatons. In spite of the fact that their missile sites are poorly organized, with missiles, fuel, crews, and warheads widely scattered so that they are at least 12 hours from takeoff, even in their fourth stage of readiness. The inaccuracy of our counter-force missiles is so great that we could not eliminate all their missiles, even if we made a first strike with no warning. It would require only about 200 Soviet warheads to devastate our cities totally, and an American strike at Soviet missile bases delivered without warning would leave almost that number not eliminated. These would be free to make a retaliatory strike at us. Moreover, the Soviets have several dozen Polaris-type submarines that can fire 4 missiles each from surfaced positions. Many of these would survive an American unannounced first strike. All this means that we are as much deterred by the Soviet missile threat as they must be by our much greater threat. Such deterrence has nothing to do with the relative size of the numbers of missiles possessed by two countries. It rests on whether an unannounced first strike would leave surviving enough missiles for a retaliatory strike capable of inflicting unacceptable damage. This is now the situation on both sides, and the existence of Polaris-type missiles makes it impossible to avoid this by striving for greater numbers of missiles, for larger warheads, able to obliterate wide areas, or for greater accuracy that would increase the statistical possibility of eliminating enemy missiles on first strike. Thus, no one will wish to make such a strike. Possibly for this reason, about a year after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviet Union ceased to work on new missile bases and accepted its permanent inferiority to the United States. But the mutual veto on the use of missiles, the nuclear stalemate, remained. This stalemate between the two superpowers on the use of nuclear weapons also extended to their use of lesser non-nuclear weapons, so that the nuclear stalemate became a superpower stalemate. This meant that much of the power of the Soviet Union and the United States, and not merely their nuclear power, was neutralized to a considerable degree, since each feared to use its non-nuclear powers for fear that they might escalate into nuclear conflict. This meant that the use of nuclear tactical weapons and even the use of non-conventional tactical weapons were inhibited to an undetermined degree by the presence of nuclear strategic weapons no one wanted to see used. The cost of using nuclear tactical weapons are so great that it is very doubtful if they are worth the cost. For example, the Western powers lack the conventional forces to stop any intrusion of the great masses of Soviet ground forces if these begin to drive westward in an attempt to conquer Germany. The West is committed to oppose such an effort. Since it is very doubtful that the NATO forces could oppose this successfully by using only conventional weapons, there would be great pressure to use the nuclear tactical weapons that NATO forces in Europe possess. It has been estimated that the chief targets of such nuclear tactical weapons would be bridges and similar narrow passages in an effort to close these Soviet advances. But it seems clear that if these passages were closed and bridges destroyed, the advance of Soviet armies in armored and mechanized divisions would be held up a few weeks at most, and up to 50 million Germans would be killed from the blast and side effects of the use of nuclear weapons. At such a cost, the Germans would probably prefer not to be defended. In fact, it appears increasingly likely that fewer and fewer advanced people will regard large-scale war as an effective method of getting anything. What could a people obtain through war that they could not obtain with greater certainty and less effort in some other way? Indeed, the very idea of winning a general war is now almost unimaginable. We do not even know what we mean by win. Whatever Germany, Japan, and Italy sought from World War II, they would surely not have obtained by winning. Yet they obtained the most significant parts of it by losing. Glory, power, and wealth may all be obtained with less effort and greater certainty by non-warlike methods. As science and technology advance, making war more horrible, they also make it possible to achieve any aims at which war might be directed by other non-violent methods. The relationship between political organizations, to us, states, are chiefly political reasons based on power and concerned with influencing the policies of other such entities. We have tended to see such relationships in dichotomies, especially the sharp contrast between violent and nonviolent methods of war and peace. In fact, however, Methods of influencing policy form a spectrum without any significant real discontinuities and range from all-out nuclear warfare at the upper end down through tactical nuclear weapons and conventional weapons, then through various levels of nonviolent political, social, and economic pressures to levels of peaceful persuasion and reciprocal favors to economic grants and even gifts. When Khrushchev renounced the use of both nuclear war and conventional violence and promised to defeat the West by peaceful competition, he was dividing the spectrum into three levels. But in fact, it is a continuous spectrum with 100 megaton bombs at the upper end and Olympic Games, international geophysical years, and foreign economic aid at the other end. When Khrushchev made his statement, he was convinced that the Soviet Union could outperform the United States on the level of peaceful competition because it could, in his opinion, overcome the American lead in the race for economic development, and that, as a result, the socialist way of life would become the model for emulation by the uncommitted nations. The failures of socialist agricultural production in Russia, Cuba, China, and elsewhere, and the great triumphs of non-socialist economies in Japan, Europe, and the United States soon revealed, even to Khrushchev's supporters, that the Soviet chances of triumphing over the West by peaceful competition were very small. Conceivably, this might force the Kremlin to raise its anti-American activities to a higher level of conflict, even to the level of violence, although probably through surrogates and satellites in a third-party area such as Southeast Asia, Africa, or Latin America. To prevent such a raising of the level of Soviet-American conflict, it might be worthwhile for the West to consider the possibility of yielding the Kremlin some victories on the lower, nonviolent levels, especially if this could be achieved at little cost to us. It might also be worthwhile for us to consider what must be Russia's real goals. Obviously, preservation of the communist regime must have a higher level of desirability to Moscow than Castro's success in Cuba or the Kremlin's control of Budapest. Thus, to the Politburo, now as earlier under Stalin, continued control in the Kremlin has a higher priority than world revolution. The West can help Russia's rulers get what they want, what they really want, their own domestic power, and at small cost, in return for what they can want only secondarily, the expansion of communism. Thus, like Stalin, they can be forced back to socialism in one country. With rising domestic demand for higher standards of living in Russia, and growing evidence that these are more likely to be obtained under some non-socialist or mixed economy, they could be forced back to non-socialism in one country. If this strengthened their own controls in the Kremlin, as it might well do. In fact, some such process is already underway. The Soviet Union has always been more conservative and less extremist in international matters than it appeared or sounded. Much of Khrushchev's truculence, even abroad, was for domestic rather than for foreign consumption. A recent study of 29 crisis situations in foreign affairs involving the Soviet Union in the 1945 to 1963 period shows that they were aggressive in only 4, were cautious in 11, and were more cautious than aggressive in 14. The 4 aggressive ones were concerned with Berlin, Hungary, the U-2 incident, and Cuba. The study showed that only 8 of the 29 crises were initiated by the Soviet Union, while 11 were initiated by the United States. The general conclusion of the study was that Soviet policy would grow increasingly conservative since they were primarily concerned with state building and retaining what they already achieved. The chief uncertainty of continuing this process arises from the problem of political succession in the Kremlin, a major unpredictable factor. Here, the chances are 2 out of 3 that the trend would continue in Soviet policy, since the one case of a successor who would reverse the more conservative policy is outbalanced by the 2 cases of a successor who would retain it, or of a disputed succession that would make an active Soviet foreign policy difficult. The fact remains that there are in the Soviet Union no institutional safeguards for any policy, just as there are none for the succession. But it is clear that pressures to continue a more moderate foreign policy will be strong under any successor, now that the Russians are increasingly convinced that their present achievements are worth keeping, as the pressures for domestic improvements continue, and as their future hopes and expectations along these lines become more clearly envisioned. In this way, the superpower neutralization and the included nuclear stalemate will continue into the future. From this flow 3 consequences. 1. Movement of the Soviet-Western rivalry down to lower, less violent levels of conflict and competition. 2. Continued disintegration of the 2 superblocks from the inability of the chief power in each to bring force against its allies because of the need to accept growing diversity within each bloc in order to retain as much as possible the appearance of unity within the bloc. This process is illustrated by Moscow's difficulties with China, Albania, and now Romania, or by Washington's troubles with de Gaulle or with its Latin American allies. 3. A growing independence of the neutrals and uncommitted nations because of their ability to act freely in the troubled waters stirred up by the Soviet-American confrontation. These changes, rooted in weapons development and technological changes, have less obvious political implications. Policy and politics are concerned with methods of influencing the behavior of others to obtain cooperation, consent, or at least acquiescence. In our Western world, power has been based to a significant extent on force, that is, weapons, and to a lesser degree on economic rewards and ideological appeal. In other cultures, such as in Africa, politics has been based to a considerable extent on other considerations such as kinship, social reciprocity, and religion. Changes in weapons within the Western state system have brought about changes in political patterns and organization that threaten to cause profound changes in political life and probably in the Western state system. For many centuries, from the 9th century to the 20th, the increasing offensive power of Western weapons systems has made it possible to compel obedience over wider and wider areas and over larger numbers of people. Accordingly, political organizations, such as the state, have been able to rule over larger areas and thus have become larger in size and fewer in numbers in our Western world. In this way, the political development of Europe over the last millennium has seen thousands of feudal areas coalesce into hundreds of principalities, and these into scores of dynastic monarchies, and finally into a dozen or more national states. The national state, its size, measured in hundreds of miles, was based to a considerable extent on the fact that the weapons systems of the 19th century, founded on citizen soldiers with handguns and moved or supplied by railroads and wagons, could apply force over hundreds of miles. This, in many cases, proved to be approximately the same size as the European linguistic and cultural groupings of peoples, and accordingly, it became easy to base the popular appeal for allegiance to the state structure upon nationalism, that is, upon this common language and cultural tradition. languages and cultures covering lesser areas than those that could be ruled over by the existing 19th century system of weapons and transport, such as the Welsh, the Britons, the Provincials, the Basques, the Catalonians, Sicilians, Ukrainians, and others, by failing to become centers for one of these dominant weapons organized structures, went into political eclipse. As the technology of weapons, transportation, communications, and propaganda continued to develop, it became possible to compel obedience over areas measured in thousands rather than hundreds of miles, and thus over distances greater than those occupied by existing linguistic and cultural groups. It thus became necessary to appeal for allegiance to the state on grounds wider than nationalism. This gave rise in the 1930s and 1940s to the idea of continental blocks and the ideological state replacing the national state, embraced by Hitler and the Japanese, and much less consciously by the United States and Britain. This growing pattern of political organization and appeal to allegiance was smashed in World War II. But during that war, technological developments increased the area over which obedience could be compelled and consent obtained. By 1950, Dulles and others talked of a two-power world, as if consent could be obtained by only two powers and as if each were hemispherical in scope. They were not, for while the area of power organizations had expanded, they had not become hemispherical, and new counterbalancing factors had appeared that threatened to reverse the whole process. Instead of power in the 1950s being concentrated in two centers, each hemispherical in scope, and able to compel obedience over distances of over 10,000 miles, the superpowers could compel obedience over distances in the range of 6,000 to 8,000 miles, leaving a considerable zone between them. In addition, the neutralization of their real power in the superpower confrontation made this zone between more obvious and weakened their ability to obtain obedience to extreme demands, even within 6,000 miles of their power centers, which were situated, let us say, in Omaha and Koibyashev. In this power gap between the less than hemispherical superpowers appeared the neutrals of the buffer fringe. But there was more to the situation than this geographical limitation. The nature of power was also changing, although few noticed this. The role of force in politics had been effective to the degree that it was able to influence the minds and wills of men. But the new weapons, in seeking increased range, had become weapons of mass destruction rather than instruments of persuasion. If the victims of such weapons are killed, they can neither obey nor consent. Thus, the new weapons have become instruments not of political power, but of destruction of all power organizations. This explains the growing reluctance by all concerned to use them. Furthermore, their range and areas of impact make them most ineffective against individual men, and especially against the minds of individual men. And finally, in an ideological state, it is the minds of men that must be the principal targets. Okay, I think we've heard that somewhere before. That government means control your mind. All right, put a post-it note there. Any organization is coordinated both by patterned relationships and by ideology and morale. If the former becomes increasingly threatened by weapons of destruction, the organization can survive by becoming decentralized, with less emphasis on organizational relationships and more emphasis on morale and outlook. They thus become increasingly amorphous and invulnerable to modern weapons of destruction. The peoples of Africa are, for this reason among others, not susceptible to compulsion by megaton bombs, and Western peoples or Soviet peoples can become less susceptible by becoming Africanized. I'm not going to comment on that. This process has not gone very far yet, but it is already observable, especially among the younger generation of the United States, Europe, and the Soviet Union. To the young in all three of these areas, there is a growing, if quiet, skepticism of any general abstract appeal to the allegiance and loyalty, and a growing concern with concrete interpersonal relationships with local groups of friends and intimates. There is still another element in this complex picture. This is also related to weapons. The past history of weapons over thousands of years shows that the reason political units have grown larger in certain periods has been because of their increased power of the offensive in the dominant weapons system, and that periods in which defensive weapons became dominant have been those in which political units remained small in area or even become smaller. The growing power of castles in the period about 1100 BC or about 900 AD made political power so decentralized and made power units so small that all power became private power and the state disappeared as a common form of political organization. Thus arose the so-called Dark Ages about 1000 BC or AD 1000. We do not expect any such extreme growth of defensive power in the future, but any increase in defensive weapon power would stop the growth in size of power areas and would, in time, reverse this tendency. There would be thus a proliferation in numbers and a decrease in size of such power units, a tendency already evident in the past 20 years in the great increase in the number of United Nations member states. No drastic increase in the defensive power of existing weapons can yet be demonstrated in any conclusive way, but the rising ability of guerrilla forces to maintain their functional autonomy shows definite limits on offensive power of contemporary weapons. Any drastic increase in the ability of guerrilla forces to function would indicate such an increase in the defensive power of existing weapons, and this, in turn, would indicate an ability to resist centralized authorities and thus an ability to maintain and defend small group freedoms. Such a rise in the strength of defensive weapons, with a consequent decentralization of power, would require a number of other changes, such as a decentralization of economic production. This probably seems very unlikely to us who live in the frantic economic expansion of the electronic revolution and the space race, but it is at least conceivable. Such a change would require a plentiful, dispersed source of industrial energy and the use of plentiful and widely scattered materials for industrial fabrication. These do not seem to be completely unlikely possibilities. For example, a shift from our present use of fossil fuels as a chief energy source to the use of the sun's energy directly in many small local energy accumulators might provide a plentiful supply of decentralized energy. More remote might be the use of tides or of differential ocean temperatures or even of the winds. Possibly some development in the use of nuclear energy, or, above all, some method for cheap separation of the oxygen and hydrogen in ordinary water that could release energy, perhaps through fuel cells as they recombine. Such a decentralized energy source, if developed, could be used to build up a decentralized industrial system using cellulose or silicone as raw materials to produce an economy of plastics and glass products, including fiberglass. These two raw materials found in vegetation and sand are among the most common substances in the world. On such a basis, with the proper development of guerrilla weapons tactics, the cost of enforcing centralized orders in local areas might rise so high that a considerable process of political decentralization and local autonomies, including local liberties, could arise, thus reversing the process of political centralization that has continued in the Western tradition for about 1,000 years. In this process, a significant role might be played by the appearance of a major non nuclear deterrence. This already exists, but is not publicly discussed because it presents such a threat to the existing world political structure. It rests in the existence of biological and chemical weapons, BCWs, that can be just as devastating as nuclear weapons and do not require a rich or elaborate industrial system for their manufacture or use. Thus, they might be more readily available or usable by the less advanced industrial nations, but are not being researched by such nations to any considerable degree because they might also be more effective as weapons against such backwards nations. All right, so now they're saying that biological weapons is the next step because they can't use nukes anymore because they'll just blow up the whole planet. So now they're going to move into biological and chemical weapons. Where we heard that before. Much of the significance of this relationship can be seen in regard to Red China. This potential enemy has already exploded some kind of nuclear device and will have a nuclear weapon in the next few years, but this offers little potential danger to us since they will have no effective long range delivery vehicle. On the other hand, their threat with this against our allies, such as Japan or the Philippines, or their ability, even now, with their mass armies to threaten our interest in India, Southeast Asia, or Korea, is potentially high. Against such a threat, our nuclear missiles are relatively weak because China is too dispersed and too decentralized to offer vital targets. On the other hand, China's vulnerability to the threat of biological warfare is very large. Wow. This explains their hysterical attacks on American germ warfare during the Korean War. The word puts them into a panic, and rightly so, since they are critically vulnerable to such weapons used by us. The virus for wheat rust and rice blast in varieties especially virulent on Chinese type plants can be produced in large amounts relatively easy at cost well below $40 a pound. Spread on the fields at the proper time in the annual growing cycle, these would destroy up to 75% of these crops. And there is no effective defense. In consequence, the Chinese food intake would be cut from about 2,200 calories per person a day, not much above the subsistence level, to about 1,300 calories a day. If the Chinese permitted this, they would have few people strong enough to work at the defense effort, either in combat areas or in industrial plants. If they tried to keep the food intake of more indispensable defenders up by strict rationing, leaving nothing for many children, old people, and women, they would suffer about 50 million deaths from malnutrition within a year. The armed forces, still largely of peasant origin, would not allow a rationing system that doomed their families in the villages and would turn against the regime, especially if an American offered to feed the Chinese on American surplus food after a Chinese surrender were broadcast to the Chinese people. Damn, they are going hard on this. The danger of such weapons becoming common or even becoming commonly known among the people of the world, including the less developed nations, is very great, opening an opportunity to all kinds of political blackmail or even to merely irresponsible threats. The parallel danger from new weapons of chemical warfare are even more horrifying. One of the nerve gases now currently available in the United States is so potent that a small drop of it on an individual's unbroken skin can cause death in a few seconds. Moreover, many of these BCWs weapons are cheap to make and easier to make than control. Most can be made in any well equipped kitchen or ordinary laboratory, with the chief restriction arising from the difficult safety precaution. But if the latter could be handled, and if delivery systems, in which some cases need be no more than men walking by fields or urban reservoirs, could be obtained, the deterrent effect of BCW weapons might be much greater than that of nuclear weapons is now, and would be much less predictable and foreseeable, since they would not be restricted, as the nuclear threat is, to heavily industrialized nations. This might well contribute towards the decentralization of power already mentioned. Another significant element in this complex picture is the convergence towards parallel paths of the United States and the Soviet Union. This is, of course, something that rabid partisans of either side will refuse to recognize. It arises from three directions. 1. There is an absolute convergence of interest between the two states, as will be indicated in a moment. 2. The structures of the two countries are, to some extent, changing in similar ways. And 3. As the only superpowers able to inflict or receive instant annihilation, these two countries, to some extent, stand apart from other states and in a class together. The last point is almost obvious, since it must be clear that only these two are prepared to engage in a race to the moon, or have an almost insatiable demand for mathematicians or space scientists, or are looked to by impoverished neutrals as obligated to provide economic assistance to the latter's ambitions. The converging of interest of the two superpowers arises largely from other two factors. These common interests include a wide variety of items, such as restricting the proliferation of nuclear weapons to additional states, establishing restrictions on the economic demands of neutral nations, especially by refusing to allow one superpower to be bid against another, the ending of nuclear testing, the slowing up of the space race, the approaching domination of the United Nations by the growing majority of small and backwards countries, the increasing aggressiveness of Red China, the unification of Germany, the acceleration of the population explosion in backwards areas, and many others. Along with this convergence of interest is the growing parallelism of the structure. 1. In spite of the great difference in the theories and the appearances of political life in the two countries, each is increasingly reaching its most fundamental decisions not through party politics or by decisions in a political assembly, but by the shifting pressures of great lobbying blocs acting upon each other by largely hidden contracts carried on behind the scenes. We got more conspiracy stuff. It's just going deep in on the conspiracy now. Of course, when she's detailing the future, it's a huge conspiracy again. 2. These pressures are chiefly concerned with the allotment of economic resources through fiscal and budgetary mechanisms among three competing sectors of the economy concerned with consumption, governmental expenditures, chiefly defense, and capital investment. 3. Socially, Both societies are undergoing a similar circulation of elites in which education is the chief doorway to social advancement and is crowded with applicants from the lower, but not lowest, stratum of society, equivalent to the petty bourgeois or lower middle classes, but is receiving relatively fewer successful applicants from the upper but not upmost group whose parents are already established in the prevalent structure. 4. In both countries, trained experts and technicians, as a consequence of this educational process, are replacing political figures or other social groups, especially political specialists. In both, military leaders, although qualified for supreme influence by their possession of power, are held at secondary levels by personal manipulations. 5. In both countries, there is a growing intellectual skepticism towards authority, accepted ideologies, and established slogans, replaced by a rising emphasis upon the need for satisfactory small group interpersonal relations. As a result of all the complex interrelationships of weapons and politics that we have mentioned up to this point, it seems very likely that the international relations of the future will shift from the world we have known, in which war was epidemic and total, to one in which conflict is endemic and controlled. The ending of total warfare means the ending of war for unlimited aims, unconditional surrender, total victory, destruction of the opponent's regime and social system, fought with weapons of total destruction and a total mobilization of resources, including men, to a condition of constant, flexible, controlled conflict with limited, specific, and shifting aims sought by limited application of diverse pressures applied against any other state whose behavior we wish to influence. Such controlled conflict would involve a number of changes in our attitudes and behavior. 1. No declarations of war and no breaking off of diplomatic relations with the adversary, but instead continuous communications with him, whatever level of intensity the conflict may reach. So this is where we're getting the they don't declare war. Congress doesn't declare war anymore. This is all part of the plan. Acceptance of the idea that conflict with an adversary in respect to some areas, activities, units, or weapons does not necessarily involve conflict with him in other areas, activities, units, or weapons. Kind of like we're at war with China, but they're also our biggest trade partner. 3. Military considerations and the use of force generally will always be subordinate to political considerations and will operate as part of policy in the whole policy context. 4. Armed forces must be fully professionalized, trained, and psychologically prepared to do any task to the degree and level they are ordered by the established political authorities without desire or independent effort to carry combat to a level of intensity not in keeping with existing policy or political considerations. 5. There must be full ability at all times to escalate or de-escalate the level of warfare as seems necessary in terms of the policy context, and to signal the decision to do either to the adversary as a guide to his responses. 6. The ability to de-escalate the level of termination of violence and warfare must be possible both in psychological and procedural terms, even with continuance of conflict on lower and non-force levels such as economic or ideological conflict. 7. There must be a full panoply of weapons and of economic, political, social, and intellectual pressures that can be used in conflict with any diverse states to secure the specific and limited goals that would become the real aims of international policy in a period of controlled conflict. 8. Among the methods we must be prepared to use in such a period must be diplomatic or tacit agreement with any other state, including the Soviet Union or Red China, to seek parallel or joint aims in the world. This will be possible if all aims are limited to specific goals which each state will recognize are not fatal to his general position and regime, and by which one specific aim can be traded against another, even tacitly. This will become possible for the double reason that professionalization of fighting forces and the growing productiveness of the superpower economies will not require either the total psychological mobilization or the almost total economic mobilization necessary in World War II. 9. All this means a blurring of the distinction between war and peace, with the situation at all times one of closely controlled conflict. In this way, endemic conflict is accepted in order to avoid, if possible, epidemic total war. The change will become possible because the ultimate policy of all states will become the preservation of their way of life and existing regime, with the largest possible freedom of action. These aims can be retained under controlled conflict, but will be lost by all concerned in total war. So basically, endless proxy wars is better than one big war for complete domination because it will basically destroy everything. In spite of this shift in the whole pattern of international power relationships, the Soviet Union will remain for a long time the chief adversary of the United States, a situation for which there is no real solution until a new and independent superpower rises on the landmass of Eurasia, preferably in a unified Western Europe. The fundamental differences between the United States and the Soviet Union will remain for a long time. They are critical and include the following. 1. A basic difference in outlook, in which the outlook of the West is based on diversity, relativism, pluralism, and social consensus, while the Russian outlook is based on a narrow range of competing opinions and little diversity of knowledge, and is monolithic, intolerant, rigid, unified, absolute, and authoritarian. 2. The difference in stages of economic development in which they are looking forward with eager anticipation to an affluent future, while we have already experienced an affluent society and are increasingly disillusioned with it. 3. The fact that the American economy is unique because it is the only economy that no longer operates in terms of scarce resources. It may be inside a framework of scarce resources, but this framework is so much wider than the other limiting features of the system, notably its fiscal and financial arrangements, that the system itself does not operate within any limits established by that wider framework. The third distinction that may be seen in the fact that in other economies, when additional demands are present to the economy, less resources are available for alternative uses. But in the American system, as it now stands, additional new demands usually lead to increased resources becoming available for alternative purposes, notable consumption. All right. Thus, if the Soviet Union embraced a substantial increase in space activity, the resources available for raising Russian levels of consumption would be reduced, while in America, any increases in the space budget makes levels of consumption also rise. It does this in the latter case because they're just printing money. No, wait. Increased space expenditures provide purchasing power for consumption that makes available previously unused resources out of the unused American productive capacity. What? Increased space expenditures provide purchasing power for consumption. Yeah, so printing money, basically. Oh, so if we print money, we have more money. Wow, I never thought of that. This unused productive capacity exists in the American economy because the structure of our economic system is such that it channels flows of funds into the production of additional capacity investment without any conscious planning process or any real desire by anyone to increase our productive capacity. It does this because certain institutions in our system, such as insurance, retirement funds, Social Security payments, undistributed corporate profits, and such, and a certain level of individuals who personally profit by the flow of funds, not theirs, into investment, continue to operate to increase investment even when they have no real desire to increase productive capacity, and indeed, many decry it. That was barely a sentence. In the Soviet Union, on the contrary, resources are allotted to the increase of productive capacity by a conscious planning process and at the cost of reducing the resources available in their system for consumption or for the government, largely defense. Thus, the meaning of the word costs and the limitations on ability to mobilize economic resources are entirely different in our system from the Soviet system and most others. In the Soviet economy, costs are real cost, measurable in terms of the allotment of scarce resources that could have been used otherwise. That sounds like Austrian economics. In the American system, costs are fiscal or financial limitations that have little connection with the use of scarce resources or even with the use of available and therefore not scarce resources. Yeah, it's like printing money, the debt based system. The reason for this is that in the American economy, the fiscal or financial limit is lower than the limit established by real resources, and therefore, since the financial limits act as the restraint on our economic activities, we do not get to the point where our activities encounter the restraints imposed by the limits of real resources, except rarely and briefly in terms of technically trained manpower, which is our most limited resource. So we got too many low IQ people, I guess that's what they're saying. These differences between the Soviet and American economies are 1. The latter has built in involuntary institutionalized investment, which the former lacks, and 2. The latter has fiscal restraints at a much lower level of economic activity, which the Soviet system also lacks. Thus, greater activity in defense in the USSR entails real cost since it puts pressure on the ceiling established by limited real resources, while greater activity in the American defense or space effort releases money into the system, which presses upward on the artificial financial ceiling, pressing it upward closer to the higher and remote ceiling established by real resource limits of the American economy. This makes available the unused productive capacity that exists in our system between the financial ceiling and the real resources ceiling. It not only makes these unused resources available for the government sector of the economy from which the expenditure was directly made, but also makes available portions of these related resources for consumption and additional capital investment. For this reason, government expenditures in the United States for things like defense or space may entail no real cost at all in terms of the economy as a whole. In fact, if the volume of unused capacity brought into use by expenditure for these things, that is, defense, and so on, is greater than the resources necessary to satisfy the need for which the expenditure was made, the volume of unused resources made available for consumption or investment will be greater than the volume of resources used in the governmental expenditure, and this additional government effort will cost nothing at all in real terms, but will entail negative real cost. Our wealth will be increased by making the effort. Well, it's not really increased. It's just that they're kicking the can down the road. They're just using the unused resources are basically the future resources. And then so they're giving credit or debt, and then they're using it, and now they're kicking the can down the road, and they're acting like, oh, we're just getting we're printing money and we're getting richer. Look, we're getting even richer. There's no real negative cost to what we're doing. Modern monetary theory. The basis for this strange and virtually unique situation is to be found in the large amount of unused productive capacity in the United States, even in our most productive years. In the second quarter of 1962, our productive system was running at a very high level of prosperity, yet it was functioning about 12% below capacity, which represented a loss of $73 billion annually. In this way, in the whole period from the beginning of 1953 to the middle of 1962, our productive system operated at $387 billion below capacity. Thus, if the system had operated near capacity, our defense effort over the 9 years would have cost us almost nothing in terms of loss of goods or capacity. This unique character in the American economy rests on the fact that the utilization of resources follows flow lines in the economy that are not everywhere reflected by corresponding flow lines of claims on wealth, that is, money. In general, in our economy, the flow lines of claims on wealth are such that they provide a very large volume of savings and a rather large volume of investment, even when no one really wants new productive capacity. They also provide an inadequate flow of consumer purchasing power in terms of the flows or potential flows of consumer goods, but they provide very limited, sharply scrutinized, and often misdirected flows of funds for the use of resources to fulfill the needs of the governmental sector of our tri-sectored economy. As a result, we have our economy of distorted resource utilization patterns with overinvestment in many areas, overstuffed consumers in one place, and impoverished consumers in another place, a drastic oversupply of social services, and widespread social needs for which public funds are lacking. In the Soviet Union, money flows follow fairly well the flows of real goods and resources, but as a result, pressures are directly on the resources. These pressures mean that saving and investment conflict directly with consumption and government services, including defense, putting the government under severe direct strains as the demands for higher standards of living cannot be satisfied except by curtailing investment, defense, space, or other governmental expenditures. Many countries of the world, especially the backwards ones, are worse off than the Soviet Union because their efforts to increase consumers' goods may well require investments based on savings that must be accumulated at the expense of consumption. In many areas, as we have seen in Asia, the Mediterranean, and Latin America, savings are accumulated by structural monetary flows, but there are no institutional flows towards investment. Little incentive or motivation for investment, and the economy lags in all three sectors. Oh, because they can't print money? So they're low on money because they can't print money. Imagine that. As a chief consequence of these conditions, the contrast between the have nations and the have not nations will become wider. This would be of a little great importance to the rest of the world were it not that the peoples of the backwards areas, riding the crisis of rising expectations, are increasingly unwilling to be ground down into poverty as their predecessors were. At the same time, the superpower stalemate increases the abilities of these nations to be neutral, to exercise influence out of all relationship to their actual powers, and to act, sometimes, in an irresponsible fashion. These areas will be the chief sources of real trouble in the future, for clashes between the United States and the Soviet Union or even Red China are unlikely to arise from direct conflicts of interest, but may well arise from conflicts over neutrals. Sounds like Venezuela. These neutrals and other peoples of backward areas have acute problems. Solutions of these problems do exist, but the underdeveloped nations are unlikely to find them. As we have indicated elsewhere, their chief problems are three: the relationships between population explosion and limited food supplies; two, the problem of political stability, especially the relationship between political aims and quite diverse weapons control patterns; and three, the problem of obtaining constructive rather than destructive patterns of outlook. The United States and the Soviet Union have a common interest in seeing that these problems find solutions. In general, these underdeveloped nations cannot follow American patterns and are attracted to the Soviet system despite its heavy cost of loss of personal freedom. We do not have either the knowledge or influence that it would take to make it possible for us to direct their steps along more desirable routes, such as that followed by Japan. One development in political life during the next generation or so that will be difficult to document is concerned with the very nature of the modern sovereign state. Like so much of our cultural heritage from the 17th century, such as international law and Puritanism, this may now be in the process of change so profound as to modify its very nature. As understood in Western Europe over the last 3 centuries, the state was the organization of sovereign power on a territorial basis. Sovereign meant that the state or ruler had supreme legal authority to do just about anything regarded as public, and this authority impinged directly on the subject or citizen without any intermediaries or buffer corporations, and did this in a dualistic power antithesis typical of the Greek two-valued logic that was applied to almost everything in the 17th century. As a part of this sovereign system, it was assumed that rights of property and of permanent association were not natural or eternal, but flowed from grants of sovereign power. Thus, property in land required the state's recognition in the form of a document or deed, and no corporation could exist except at the charter of the sovereign or with his tacit consent. Moreover, all citizens on the territory were subject to the same sovereign power. The latter consisted, as it still largely does in our tradition, of a mixture of force, military, economic rewards, and ideological uniformity. This view of public authority is by no means universal in the world, and shows strong indications that it may be changing in the West. Corporations exist and have the earliest mark of divinity, immortality, and have become, as they were in the non-sovereign Middle Ages, refuges where individuals may function shielded from the reach of the sovereign state. The once almost universal equivalence between residence and citizenship may be weakening. If the ideological state continues to develop its likely characteristics, persons of different ideologies and thus different allegiances may become intermingled on the same territory. The number of refugees and resident aliens is now increasing in most countries. All right. I guess that's a good place to stop when it's talking about that. All right. So we can see that this is kind of talking about what's happening now, that basically the nuclear stalemate is leading up to a bunch of tiny countries being able to join the United Nations and ask for a bunch of stuff because they know that basically the superpowers can't start a nuclear war realistically because it will just blow up the whole planet. And so you can see they're moving into like the soft power control. They're already talking about using biological and chemical weapons, propaganda, political power, economic incentives and disincentives, and all types of other soft power type of things because they can't just go to like a full war anymore. And then you can see that there's the policy of, the different types of wars in the satellite states or proxy wars, whatever, where they are not going to directly attack any of the superpowers, but they're going to have limited conflicts in exchange for limited goals, like, you back off here, we'll do this. You do that, we'll do this, instead of a complete destruction and takeover of the entire culture like was going on before World War II. So I guess we're getting close to the end now. About 100 pages left in the book, so maybe it might be finished this year. That's it for this video. Thanks for watching if you did. If you didn't, you probably won't hear this part anyway. So have a good day and peace.